The Muqaddimah Chapter 5 Part 3 and Chapter 6 Part 1. 31. The craft of singing and music. This craft is concerned with the setting of poems to music. 2:14. This is done by scanning the sounds according to well-known fixed proportions, which causes any sound, complex, thus scanned to constitute a tune, a rhythmic mode. These modes are then combined with each other according to accepted proportions. The result is pleasant to listen to because of its harmony and the quality that harmony gives to the sounds. This is as follows, as explained in the science of music. Sounds are in certain proportions, intervals, to each other. A sound may be 1/2, 1/4, 1/5, or 1/11 of another sound. The difference in interval between the sounds that reach the ear transforms them from simple sounds to combinations of sounds. Not every combination is pleasant to listen to. There are special combinations that are pleasant. They have been enumerated and discussed by musicologists, as is mentioned in the proper place. The music produced by the rhythmic modes of singing may be supplemented by scanning other sounds that come from solids and are produced by either beating or blowing into instruments used for the purpose. Such instrumental music adds to the pleasure of listening. Various kinds of instruments are used in the contemporary makrib. There is the woodwind instrument called shababa. 215. It is a hollow reed with a number of holes on the sides. One blows into it, and it gives a sound. The sound escapes from the hollow of the reed, straight 216 through these holes. It is scanned by placing the fingers of both hands upon these holes in conventionally accepted ways. This creates the proper intervals between the sounds and also combines them harmoniously. As a result, they are pleasant to listen to when one hears them, because of the harmony we have mentioned. Another similar kind of instrument is the woodwind instrument called zalami. 217. It has the form of a reed, with two wooden parts carved, hollow but not round, because it is made of two pieces put together. It also has a number of holes. One blows into it through a small connected reed which directs the wind to the holes. This produces a high-pitched tone. The fingers are placed upon the holes, and the sounds are thus scanned in the same way as on the shababa. One of the best wind instruments at this time is the bug. 218. This is a trumpet of copper, brass, which is hollow, 1 cubit long, widening toward the opening, the diameter of which is less than 219 the palm of a hand in width. It has the form of a nibbed calamus. One blows into it through a small reed which conveys the wind from the mouth into it. The sound comes out compact and loud. It also has a number of holes, and makes a harmonious tune of pleasant effect, which is produced in the same way as in the aforementioned instruments, by placing the fingers on the holes. Then, there are the string instruments. They are all hollow. They may have either the shape of a section of a sphere, as, for instance, the barbiton and the rebec, or a square shape, such as the ganun. 220. The strings are placed upon the surface of the instrument. They are tied at the head to pegs that can be turned, so that it is possible to tighten or loosen the strings, as required, by turning them. The strings are either plucked with another piece of wood or played, with a string fastened between the two ends of a bow that passes over the strings of the instrument, after it had been waxed with wax or mastic, kunder. Sounds are scanned through lightning, the pressure of the hand that guides the bow over the strings, or through transferring the bow from one string to another. Moreover, in all string instruments, the fingers of the left hand can be used to beat or pluck the ends of the strings. Thus, there originate harmonious, pleasant sounds. Moreover, brass kettles may be beaten with sticks, or pieces of wood may be beaten against each other in a harmonious rhythm. This creates a feeling of pleasure as the result of the music one hears. Let us explain the reason for the pleasure resulting from music. This is as follows, as has been established in the proper place, pleasure is the attainment of something that is agreeable. Such a thing, in sensual perception, can only be a quality. If such a quality is proportionate and agreeable to the person who has the perception, it is pleasant. If it is repugnant to him or discordant, it is painful. Agreeable foods are those whose quality corresponds to the temper of the sense of taste. The same applies to agreeable sensations of touch. Agreeable smells are those that correspond to the temper of the vaporous cordial spirit, because that spirit is what perceives and receives them through the medium of the sense of smell. Thus, aromatic plants and flowers smell better and are more agreeable to the spirit, because heat, which is the temper of the cordial spirit, is preponderant in them. Agreeable sensations of vision and hearing are caused by harmonious arrangement in the forms and qualities of the things seen or heard. This impresses the soul as harmonious and is more agreeable to it. If an object of vision is harmonious in the forms and lines given to it in accordance with the matter from which it is made, so that the requirements of its particular matter as to perfect harmony and arrangement are not disregarded, that being the meaning of beauty and loveliness whenever these terms are used for any object of sensual perception, that object of vision is then in harmony with the soul that perceives it, and the soul, thus, feels pleasure as the result of perceiving something that is agreeable to it. Therefore, lovers who are most deeply in love express their extreme infatuation by saying that their spirit is commingled with that of the beloved. 221. In another sense, the meaning of it is that existence is shared by all existent things, as the philosophers say. Therefore, existent things love to commingle with something in which they observe perfection, in order to become one with it. The object that is most suited to man and in which he is most likely to perceive perfect harmony, is the human form. Therefore, it is most congenial to him to perceive beauty and loveliness in the lines and sounds of the human form. Thus, every man desires beauty in the objects of vision and hearing, as a requirement of his nature. Beauty in the objects of hearing is harmony and lack of discordance in the sounds. This is as follows: sounds have certain qualities. They may be whispered or loud, soft or strong, vibrant or constrained, and so on. Harmony between them is what gives them beauty. Firstly, the transition from one sound to a contrary or identical sound, as well as the return to the first sound, is not made suddenly but gradually. There must be something to bridge the gap between the two sounds. This may be compared with the fact that linguists consider clusters of sounds of discordant or similar articulation ugly. This belongs to the same category. Secondly, the sounds must have harmonious intervals, as was mentioned at the beginning of the chapter. The transition from a sound to a sound 1/2, 1/3, or some other fraction of it, must take place in a harmonious manner according to the rules established by musicologists. When the sounds are harmonious with regard to their qualities, as has been mentioned by musicologists, they are agreeable and pleasant. Such harmony may be a simple one. Many people are gifted to achieve it by nature. They do not need any special instruction or craft for it, for we find people who are gifted by nature for the meters of poetry, the rhythms of the dance, and similar things. The common people call such an aptitude musicalness. Midmer. 222. Many Quran readers belong in this category. In reciting the Quran, they know well how to modulate their voices, as if they were flutes. They thus cause emotion through the beauty of their performance. 223. And the harmony of their modes. Harmony may also result from composition. Not all human beings are alike in their knowledge of it, nor are they all equally able by nature to practice it, if they know it. This is the melodious music with which the science of music has to deal, as we shall explain later on among the sciences. 224. Malik disapproved of the use of melodies in reciting the Quran, 225, and Ash-Shafi'i permitted it. Here it is not a question of artistic musical melodies. There can be no difference of opinion as to the fact that they are forbidden. The art of singing is something entirely unconnected with the Quran. It is true, in the recitation and pronunciation of the Quran, each letter, sound, requires a certain quantity of sound for its particular pronunciation, inasmuch as, for instance, the lengthening of vowels in the proper places is concerned. 226 The longer or shorter pronunciation of long vowels, 227 and similar things. Melodious music also requires a certain quantity of sound to materialize, because, as we have stated, its real meaning is harmony. However, considering the one thing ruins the other, 228 since they are the opposite of each other. The recitation of the Quran must be given preference, in order to avoid any change in traditional transmission in connection with the Quran. Thus, melodious music can, by no means, be combined with the pronunciation under consideration in connection with the Quran. As regards the difference of opinion among authorities as to the permissibility of melodious music for the recitation of the Quran, the thing the authorities have in mind is the plain music to which nature guides the person who is musical, midmer, as we have stated. Such a person arranges his sounds in certain harmonious cadences, which those who know about singing, as well as others, perceive as music. 229 This is the point about which the difference of opinion revolves. The obvious fact is that the Quran is to be kept free of it, exactly as the Imam Malik thought. The Quran is something that causes awe, as it reminds man of death and what comes after it. It is not an occasion to give pleasure in the perception of beautiful sounds. It was, in this spirit, that the men around Muhammad recited the Quran, as is stated in their biographies. The statement by Muhammad, a flute of those belonging to the family of David was brought to him, 230 does not refer to cadences and melodious music, but it refers to a beautiful voice, a clear pronunciation in reciting the Quran, and a clear distinction in the articulation and enunciation of the letters, sounds. Since we have mentioned the meaning of singing, it should be known that singing originates in a civilization when it becomes abundant and, people, progress from the necessities to the conveniences, and then to the luxuries, and have a great diversity of luxuries. Then, the craft of singing originates, because it is required only by those who are free from all the necessary and urgent needs of making a living and care for domestic and other needs. It is in demand only by those who are free from all other worries and seek various ways of having pleasure. In the non-Arab states before Islam, music was highly developed in cities and towns. They, non-Arab, rulers cultivated it eagerly. It went so far that the Persian rulers felt a great concern for musicians. Musicians had a place in their dynasty and attended their sessions and gatherings and sang for them. The same is, still, the case with the known Arabs at this time in all their regions and provinces. The Arabs originally had, only, poetry. 231 They composed a kind of speech consisting of equal parts of harmonious proportions, as far as the number of consonants with and without vowels was concerned. Within these parts, they divided speech in such a way that each part made sense by itself and did not have to lean upon the other. Such part of speech they called verse. It is agreeable to nature first by its division into parts, then by the harmonious arrangements of its parts at the ends and beginnings, 232 and then by the fact that it conveys the intended meaning and uses expressions conforming to that meaning. The Arabs appreciated poetry very highly. It was distinguished in their speech through a certain nobility, because it alone possessed harmony. They made poetry the archive of their history, 233 their wisdom, and their nobility, and the touchstone of their natural gift for expressing themselves correctly, choosing the best methods, uslub, of expression. They have continued to do so. The harmony resulting from a division of speech into parts, and into an equal number of consonants with and without vowels, is just one small drop in the ocean of sound harmony, as is well known from the literature 234 on music. However, the Arabs did not know anything except poetry, because at that time, they practiced no science and knew no craft. The desert attitude was their dominant trait. Now, camel drivers sang when they drove their camels, and young men sang when they were alone, with each other at times of leisure and recreation. 235 They repeated sounds and hummed them. When such humming was applied to poetry, it was called singing. When it was applied to the praise of God or some kind of recitation of the Quran, it was called takbir. Abu Ishaq Az-Zajjaj 236 explained this word as, derived from al-gbur, that is, melodies, reminding one of al-ghabr that which remains, that is, the affairs of the other world. When the Arabs sang, they often effected a simple harmony between the modes, as was mentioned by Ibn Rashid at the end of the Kitab al-Umda, 237 and by others. This was called synod. Most Arab music was in the light rhythm, kayfif, that is used for dancing and marching, accompanied by drums and flutes. It causes emotion and makes the serious-minded feel light. 238 The Arabs called that hazaj. All these simple types of melodious music are primary ones. It is not unlikely to assume that they can be grasped by nature without any instruction, as is the case with all simple crafts. The Arabs continued this way during their desert and pre-Islamic period. Then, Islam made its appearance. The Arabs took possession of all the realms of the world. They deprived the non-Arabs of their rule and took it over. They had their well-known desert attitude and low standard of living. In addition, they possessed the thriving 239 religion of Islam, and that Muslim religious severity which is directed against all activities of leisure and all the things that are of no utility in one's religion or livelihood. Therefore, music was avoided to some degree. In their opinion, only the cadenced recitation of the Quran and the humming of poetry, which had always been their way and custom, were pleasurable things. Then, luxury and prosperity came to them, because they obtained the spoils of the nations. They came to lead splendid and refined lives and to appreciate leisure. The singers, now, left the Persians and Byzantines. They descended upon the Hijaz and became clients of the Arabs. They all sang accompanied by lutes, pandors, lyres, 240 and flutes. The Arabs heard their melodious use of sound, and they set their poems to music accordingly. In Medina, Nashid al-Farsi, 241 Tuways, and Saib Qadir, a client of Abdallah b. Jafar, b. Abt Talib, made their appearance. They heard the poems of the Arabs and set them to music. They did it well, and they became famous. Ma'bad and his class of singers, as well as Ibn Surayy and his ilk, learned from them. Continual and gradual progress was made in the craft of singing. Eventually, in the days of the Abbasids, the craft of singing reached its perfection with Ibrahim b. al-Mahdi, Ibrahim al-Mawzili, Ibrahim's son Ishaq, and Ishaq's son Hamid. 242, the music, and the musical sessions of Baghdad during the Abbasid dynasty have remained a topic of conversation down to the present time. People at that time constantly had games and entertainments. Dancing equipment, consisting of robes and sticks, and poems to which melodies were hummed, were used. That was transformed into a special kind of entertainment. Other dancing equipment, called courage, was also used. The courage is a wooden figure, resembling a saddled horse, and is attached to robes such as women wear. The dancers thus give the appearance of having mounted horses. They attack and withdraw 243 and compete in skill with weapons. There were other such games intended for banquets, wedding parties, festivals, and other gatherings for leisure and entertainment. There was much of that sort in Baghdad and the cities of the Iraq. It spread from there to other regions. The Mawzilis had a young apprentice servant by name Ziryab, 244, who had learned from them how to sing. He learned so well that they became jealous of him and sent him away to the west. He joined al-Hakam b. Hisham b. Abd Rahman I, the Emir of Spain. He, al-Hakam, honored him greatly. He rode out to welcome him. He showered him with gifts, fiefs, and allowances. He gave him a place in his dynasty as one of his boon companions. The musical heritage Ziryab left in Spain was transmitted down to the time of the Reyes de Tafas. In Sevilla, the craft of singing was highly developed. After Sevilla had lost its affluence, the craft of singing was transplanted from there to the coast of Afriqiya and the Maghrib. It spread over the cities there. A sprinkling of it is still left there, despite retrogression in the civilization of the region and the decreasing power of its dynasties. The craft of singing is the last of the crafts attained in civilization, because it constitutes the last development toward luxury with regard to no occupation in particular save that of leisure and gaiety. It also is the first to disappear from a given civilization when it disintegrates and retrogresses. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 245. 32. The crafts, especially writing and calculation, give intelligence to the person who practices them. 246. We 247 have already mentioned in the book that the rational soul exists in man only potentially. 248 Its transformation from potentially into actuality is effected first by new sciences and perception derived from the sensibilia, and then by the later acquisition of knowledge through the speculative power. Eventually, it comes to be actual perception and pure intellect. Thus, it becomes a spiritual essence, and its existence then reaches perfection. Therefore it is necessary that each kind of learning and speculation should provide the rational soul with additional intelligence. Now, the crafts and the habit of the crafts always lead to the obtainment of scientific norms, which results from habit. Therefore, any experience provides intelligence. The habits of the crafts provide intelligence. Perfect sedentary culture provides intelligence, because it is a conglomerate of crafts characterized by concern for the domestic economy, contact with one's fellow men, attainment of education through mixing with one's fellow men, and also administration of religious matters and understanding the ways and conditions governing them. All these factors are norms of how to do things, which, properly arranged, constitute scientific disciplines. Thus, an increase in intelligence results from them. In this respect, writing is the most useful craft because, in contrast to the other crafts, it deals with matters of theoretical, scientific interest. This is explained through the circumstance that writing involves a transition from the forms of the written letters to the verbal expressions in the imagination, and from the verbal expressions in the imagination to the concepts underlying them, which are in the soul. 249 The writer, thus, always goes from one indication 250 to another, as long as he is wrapped up in writing, and the soul becomes used to the constant repetition of the process. Thus, it acquires the habit of going over from the indications to the things meant by them. This is what is meant by intellectual speculation, by means of which the knowledge of, hitherto, unknown sciences is provided. As the result of being accustomed to the process of going over from the indications to the things indicated by them, people acquire the habit of intellection, which constitutes an increase in intelligence and provides an additional insight into affairs and a shrewd understanding of them. This is why Khosrov remarked of his secretaries, when he noticed that they had that kind of insight and shrewd understanding, duena, that is, they are Satans, devils, and crazy. This is said to be the etymology of diwan, the ministry of the secretaries. 251. Calculation 252 is connected with writing. Calculation entails a kind of working with numbers, combining and separating them. 253 which requires much deductive reasoning and speculation, and this is what is meant by intelligence. God brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers. You did not then know anything. And he gave you hearing and vision and hearts. You are little grateful. 254. Chapter 6. The various kinds of sciences. The methods of instruction. The conditions that obtain in these connections. The chapter includes a prefatory discussion. And Appendices 1. Prefatory discussion 2. On man's ability to think, which distinguishes human beings from animals and which enables them to obtain their livelihood, to cooperate to this end with their fellow men, and to study the Master whom they worship, and the revelations that the messengers transmitted from him. God thus caused all animals to obey man and to be in the grasp of his power. Through his ability to think, God gave man superiority over many of his creatures. 1. Man's ability to think. It 5 should be known that God distinguished man from all the other animals by an ability to think which he made the beginning of human perfection and the end of man's noble superiority over existing things. This comes about as follows: perception, that is, consciousness, on the part of the person who perceives, in his essence of things that are outside his essence, is something peculiar to living beings to the exclusion of all other beings and existent things. Living beings may obtain consciousness of things that are outside their essence through the external senses God has given them, that is, the senses of hearing, vision, smell, taste, and touch. Man has this advantage over the other beings that he may perceive things outside his essence through his ability to think, which is something beyond his senses. It is the result of special powers placed in the cavities of his brain. 7. With the help of these powers, man takes the pictures of the sensibilia, applies his mind to them, and thus abstracts from them other pictures. The ability to think is the occupation with pictures that are beyond sense perception, and the application of the mind to them for analysis and synthesis. This is what is meant by the word afida hearts in the Quran. He gave you hearing and vision and hearts. 8. Afida hearts is the plural of fudidi. It means here the ability to think. The ability to think has several degrees. The first degree is man's intellectual understanding of the things that exist in the outside world in a natural or arbitrary order, so that he may try to arrange them with the help of his own power. This kind of thinking mostly consists of perceptions. It is the discerning intellect, 8a, with the help of which man obtains the things that are useful for him and his livelihood, and repels the things that are harmful to him. The second degree is the ability to think, which provides man with the ideas and the behavior needed in dealing with his fellow men and in leading them. It mostly conveys apperceptions, which are obtained one by one through experience, until they have become really useful. This is called the experimental intellect. The third degree is the ability to think, which provides the knowledge, or hypothetical knowledge, of an object beyond sense perception without any practical activity going with it. This is the speculative intellect. It consists of both perceptions and apperceptions. They are arranged according to a special order, following special conditions, and thus provide some other knowledge of the same kind, that is, either perceptive or apperceptive. Then, they are again combined with something else, and again provide some other knowledge. The end of the process is to be provided with the perception of existence as it is, with its various genera, differences, reasons, and causes. By thinking about these things, man achieves perfection in his reality and becomes pure intellect and perceptive soul. This is the meaning of human reality. 2. The world of the things that come into being as the result of action, materializes through thinking. It should be known that the world of existent things comprises pure essences, such as the elements, the things resulting from their influence, and the three things that come into being from the elements, namely, minerals, plants, and animals. All these things are connected with the divine power. It also comprises actions proceeding from living beings, that happen through their intentions, and are connected with the power that God has given them. Some of their actions are well arranged and orderly. Such are human actions. Others are not well arranged and orderly. They are the actions of living beings other than man. This is because 9 thinking perceives the order that exists among the things that come into being either by nature or through arbitrary arrangement. When it intends to create something, it must understand the reason or cause of that thing, or the conditions governing it, for the sake of the order that exists among the things that come into being. Reason, cause, or conditions, are, in general, the principles of that particular thing, since it is secondary to them, and it is not possible to arrange for something that comes earlier to come later, or for something that comes later to come earlier. Such a principle must have another principle to which its own existence is posterior. This regression may go on in an ascending order, from principle to principle, or it may come to an end. Now, when man, in his thinking, has reached the last principle on 2, 3, or more levels, and starts the action that will bring the planned thing into existence, he will start with the last principle that has been reached by his thinking. Thus, that last principle will be the beginning of action. He, then, will follow things up to the last element in the causal chain that had been the starting point of his thinking activity. For instance, if a man thinks of bringing into existence a roof to shelter him, he will progress in his mind, from the roof, to the wall supporting the roof, and then to the foundation upon which the wall stands. Here, his thinking will end, and he will then start to work on the foundation, then, go on to the wall, and then, to the roof, with which his action will end. This is what is meant by the saying, the beginning of action is the end of thinking, and the beginning of thinking is the end of action. 10. Thus, human action in the outside world materializes only through thinking about the order of things, since things are based upon each other. After he has finished thinking, he starts doing things. His thinking starts with the thing that comes last in the causal chain and is done last. His action starts with the first thing in the causal chain, which thinking reaches last. Once this order is taken into consideration, human actions proceed in a well-arranged manner. On the other hand, the actions of living beings other than man are not well arranged. They lack the thinking that acquaints the agent with the order of things governing his actions. Animals 11 perceive only with the senses. Their perceptions are disconnected and lack a connecting link, since only thinking can constitute such a connecting link. Now, the things that come into being 12 that are of consequence in the world of existent things, are those that are orderly. Those that are not orderly are secondary to them. The actions of animals, therefore, are subordinate to orderly human actions. Consequently, their services are forcibly utilized by man. Thus, human actions control the whole world of things that come into being and all it contains. Everything is subservient to man and works for him. This is what is meant by the appointing of a representative mentioned in the Quran, I am appointing a representative on earth. 13. The ability to think is the quality of man by which human beings are distinguished from other living beings. The degree to which a human being is able to establish an orderly causal chain determines his degree of humanity. Some people are able to establish a causal nexus for 2 or 3 levels. Some are not able to go beyond that. Others may reach 5 or 6. Their humanity, consequently, is higher. For instance, some chess players are able to perceive, in advance, 3 or 5 moves the order of which is arbitrary. Others are unable to do that, because their mind is not good enough for it. This example is not quite to the point, because the knowledge of chess is a habit, whereas the knowledge of causal chains is something natural. However, it is an example the student may use to gain an intellectual understanding of the basic facts mentioned here. God created man and gave him superiority over many of his creatures. 14. 3. The experimental intellect and how it comes into. One knows from philosophical works the statement that man is political by nature. 15. The philosophers cite that statement in connection with establishing the existence of prophecy and other things. The adjective political refers to the town, polis, which they use as another word for human social organization. The statement means that a single human being cannot live by himself, and his existence can materialize only in association with his fellow men. Alone, he would be unable to have a complete existence and lead a complete life. By his very nature, he needs the cooperation of others to satisfy all his needs. Such cooperation requires, firstly, consultation, and, then, association and the things that follow after it. Dealings with other people, when there is oneness of purpose, may lead to mutual affection, and when the purposes differ, they 1-5a may lead to strife and altercation. Thus, mutual dislike and mutual affection, friendship and hostility, originate. This leads to war and peace among nations and tribes. Among human beings, this does not happen haphazardly, as is the case among stray animals. God caused human beings to act in an orderly and well-arranged manner, as the result of their ability to think, as has been mentioned before. 16. Therefore, God had, their actions, take place among them in an orderly manner. And He enabled them to arrange for, their activities, under political aspects and according to philosophical norms. Those, political aspects and philosophical norms, lead human beings from the things that are detrimental, to them, to those that are in their interest, and from evil to the good. First, however, they must recognize the things that are evil, and the detrimental effect of doing them, from sound experience and current customs. Thus, they are distinguished from stray animals. The result of their ability to think shows itself in the fact that their actions are orderly and not likely to be detrimental. The concepts bringing this about are not completely divorced from sensual perception and do not require very deep study. All of them are obtained through experience and derived from it. They are particular 17 concepts connected with the sensibilia. Their truth or falsehood soon comes out in events. From events, the student of these concepts can learn them. Each human being can learn as much of them as he is able to. He can pick up his knowledge, with the help of experience among the events that occur in his dealings with his fellow men. Eventually, he will have what is necessary and must be done, and must not be done, fixed in his mind. By knowing this well, 18 then, the proper habit of dealing with his fellow men will be obtained by him. Those who follow this procedure, during their whole life become acquainted with every single problem, but things that depend on experience require time. God made it easy for many human beings to obtain this social knowledge, in a time shorter than the time required to obtain it through experience, if they will follow the experience of their fathers, teachers, and elders, learn from them, and accept their instruction. People can, thus, dispense with lengthy and careful, personal, study of events and need not attempt to pick out concepts from them. But people who have no knowledge or tradition in this respect, or people who are not willing to learn and to follow others, need long and careful study in order to be educated in these things. They are unfamiliar to them, and the knowledge they obtain of them is uneven. Their manners and dealings with others will be badly planned and show defects. Their chances of making a living among their fellow men will be spoiled. This is the meaning of the famous saying, "He who is not educated by his parents will be educated by time." 19. That is, he who does not acquire the manners needed in dealing with human beings from his parents, which includes teachers and elders, and does not learn these things from them, has to fall back upon learning them with the help of nature from the events that happen in the course of time. Thus, time will teach and educate him, because he needs that education, since, by his very nature, he needs the cooperation of others. Such is the experimental intellect. It is obtained after the discerning intellect that leads to action, as we have explained. After these two intellects, there is the higher degree of the speculative intellect. Many scholars have undertaken to explain it, and it is, therefore, not necessary to explain it in this book. God gave you hearing and vision and hearts. You are little grateful. 20. 4. The sciences, knowledge, of human beings and the sciences, knowledge, of angels. We observe in ourselves through sound intuition 21 the existence of three worlds. The first of them is the world of sensual perception. We become aware of it by means of the perception of the senses, which the animals share with us. Then, we become aware of the ability to think, which is a special quality of human beings. We learn from it that the human soul exists. This knowledge is necessitated by the fact that we have in us scientific perceptions which are above the perceptions of the senses. They must thus be considered as another world, above the world of the senses. Then, we deduce the existence of a third world, above us, from the influences that we find it leaves in our hearts, such as volition and an inclination toward active motions. Thus, we know that there exists an agent there who directs us toward those things from a world above our world. That world is the world of spirits and angels. It contains essences that can be perceived because of the existence of influences they exercise upon us, despite the gap between us and them. Often, we may deduce the existence of that high spiritual world and the essences it contains, from visions and things we had not been aware of while awake but which we find in our sleep and which are brought to our attention in it and which, if they are true, dreams, conform with actuality. We thus know that they are true and come from the world of truth. Confused dreams, on the other hand, are pictures of the imagination that are stored inside by perception and to which the ability to think is applied, after man has retired from sense perception. 22. We do not find any clearer proof than this for the existence of the spiritual world. Thus, we have a general knowledge of it, but no particulars. The metaphysicians make conjectures about details concerning the essences of the spiritual world and their order. They call these essences intellects. However, none of it is certain, because the conditions of logical argumentation as established in logic do not apply to it. One of these conditions is that the propositions of the argument must be primary and essential, but the spiritual essences are of an unknown essentiality. Thus, logical argumentation cannot be applied to them. Our only means of perceiving something of the details of these worlds are what we may glean from matters of religious law, as explained and established by religious faith. Of the three worlds, the one we can perceive best is the world of human beings, since it is existential and attested by our corporeal and spiritual perceptions. The world of the senses is shared by us with the animals, but the world of the intellect and the spirits is shared by us with the angels, whose essences are of the same kind as the essences of that world. They are essences free from corporeality and matter, and they are pure intellect in which intellect, thinker, and the object of thinking are one. It is, in a way, an essence the reality of which is perception and intellect. The sciences, knowledge, of the angels, thus, always agree by nature with the things to be known. They can never have any defect. The knowledge of human beings, on the other hand, is the attainment of the form of the thing to be known in their essences, after it had not been there. It is all acquired. The essence in which the forms of the things to be known are obtained, namely, the soul, is a material substance 23 that gradually takes over the forms of existence with the help of the forms of the things to be known that it obtains. Eventually, it reaches perfection, and, through death, its existence fulfills itself as regards both its matter and its form. The objects in the soul are subject to constant vacillation between negation and assertion. One of the two is sought by means of some middle term, to connect the two extremes. When that is achieved and the object has become known, it must be explained that there exists agreement between knowledge and the thing known. Such agreement may often be clarified by technical logical argumentation, but that is from behind the veil, and it is not like the direct vision 23a that is found in connection with the sciences, knowledge, of the angels. The veil may be removed, and the agreement may, thus, be affected through direct perceptive vision. It has been explained that human beings are ignorant by nature, because vacillation affects their knowledge. They learn through acquisition of knowledge and technique, because they obtain the objects they seek by applying their ability to think according to technical rules. The removal of the veil to which we have referred is achieved only through training in dhikr exercises, 24 of which the best is prayer, which forbids sinful and evil actions through abstinence from all distracting food of consumption, of which the most important part 25 is fasting, and through devoting oneself to God with all one's powers. God taught man what he did not know. 26. 5. The sciences, knowledge, of the prophets. We find that this kind of human being is in a divine condition that is different from ordinary human ambitions and conditions. In prophets, the trend toward the divine is more powerful than their humanity, as far as the powers of perception, the powers of desire, that is, concupiscence and wrath, and the other conditions of the body are concerned. Prophets keep away from things human, except inasmuch as they are necessary for life. They turn toward divine matters, such as worship and the remembrance, dhikr, of God, as their knowledge of Him requires. They give information about Him and transmit the revelation for the guidance of the nation of believers, which they received in their divine condition. They do that according to one particular method and in a manner known to be peculiar to them. It undergoes no change in them and is like a natural disposition which God has given them. Revelation has already been discussed by us at the beginning of the book. In the chapter dealing with people who possess supernatural perception 27, we explained there that the whole of existence in all its simple and composite worlds is arranged in a natural order of ascent and descent, so that everything constitutes an uninterrupted continuum. The essences at the end of each particular stage of the worlds are by nature prepared to be transformed into the essence adjacent to them, either above or below them. This is the case with the simple material elements. It is the case with palms and vines, which constitute the last stage of plants, in their relation to snails and shellfish, which constitute the lowest stage of animals. It is also the case with monkeys, creatures combining in themselves cleverness and perception, in their relation to man, the being who has the ability to think and to reflect. The preparedness for transformation that exists on either side, at each stage of the worlds, is meant when we speak about their connection 27a. Above the human world, there is a spiritual world. It is known to us by its influence upon us, in that it gives us the powers of perception and volition. The essences of that spiritual world are pure perception and absolute intellection. It is the world of the angels. It follows from all this that the human soul must be prepared to exchange humanity for angelicality, in order actually to become part of the angelic species at any time, in a single instant. It will afterwards resume its humanity. But in the world of angelicality, it has meanwhile accepted ideas that it is charged to transmit to its fellow human beings. That is the meaning of revelation and being addressed by the angels. All prophets possess this predisposition. It is like a natural disposition for them. In exchanging their humanity for angelicality, they experience strain and sensations of choking, as is known in this connection. 28. Their supernatural knowledge is one of direct observation and vision. No mistake or slip attaches itself to it, and it is not affected by errors or unfounded assumptions. The agreement in it is an essential one, because the veil of the supernatural is gone, and clear and direct observation has been attained. When 29, the prophets quit that state and reassume their humanity, this clarity does not quit the knowledge they have, for it has become attached to it in the former condition. And because they possess the virtue that brings them to that condition, their experience constantly repeats itself, until their guidance of the nation of believers, which was the purpose for which they were sent, is accomplished. Thus, it is said in the Quran, I am merely a human being like you, to whom it has been revealed that your God is one God. Thus, be straightforward with him and ask him for forgiveness. 30. This should be understood. One should compare what we said earlier at the beginning of the book, about the different kinds of people possessing supernatural perception. It will constitute clear comment and explanation. There, we have explained the matter at sufficient length. God gives success. 6. Man is essentially ignorant, and becomes learned through acquiring knowledge. We have already explained at the beginning of these sections 31 that man belongs to the genus of animals and that God distinguished him from them by the ability to think, which he gave man and through which man is able to arrange his actions in an orderly manner. This is the discerning intellect. Or, when it helps him to acquire from his fellow men a knowledge of ideas and of the things that are useful or detrimental to him, it is the experimental intellect. Or, when it helps him to obtain perception of the existent things as they are, whether they are absent or present, 32 it is the speculative intellect. Man's ability to think comes to him, only, after the animality in him has reached perfection. It starts from discernment. Before man has discernment, he has no knowledge whatever, and is counted one of the animals. His origin, the way in which he was created from a drop of sperm, a clot of blood, and a lump of flesh, 33 still determines his mental makeup. Whatever he attains subsequently is the result of sensual perception and the heart's, that is, the ability to think, God has given him. In recounting the favor he bestowed upon us, God said, and he gave you hearing and vision and hearts. 34. In his first condition, before he has attained discernment, man is simply matter, inasmuch as he is ignorant of all knowledge. He reaches perfection of his form through knowledge, which he acquires through his own organs. Thus, his human essence reaches perfection of existence. One may compare the word of God when his prophet began to receive the revelation. Recite, in the name of your Lord who created man out of a clot of blood. Recite, and your Lord the most noble who taught with the calamus, taught man what he did not know. 35 That is, he let him acquire knowledge he did not yet possess, after he had been a clot of blood and a lump of flesh. Man's nature and essence reveal to us the essential ignorance and acquired character of the knowledge that man possesses, and the noble verse of the Quran refers to it at the very beginning and opening of the revelation, and establishes through it the fact that man has received from God, as a favor, the first of the stages of his existence, which is humanity and its two conditions, the innate one and the acquired one. God has been knowing and wise. 36. 7. Scientific instruction is a craft. 37. This is because skill in a science, knowledge of its diverse aspects, and mastery of it are the result of a habit which enables its possessor to comprehend all the basic principles of that particular science, to become acquainted with its problems, and to evolve the details of it from its principles. As long as such a habit has not been obtained, skill in a particular discipline is not forthcoming. Habit is different from understanding and knowing by memory. Understanding of a single problem in a single discipline may be found equally in someone well versed in the particular discipline and in the beginner, in the common man who has no scientific knowledge whatever, and in the accomplished scholar. Habit, on the other hand, belongs solely and exclusively to the scholar or the person well versed in scientific disciplines. This shows that scientific habit is different from understanding. All habits are corporeal, whether they are of the body, or, like arithmetic, oft brain and resulting from man's ability to think and so on. All corporeal things are sensibilia. Thus, they require instruction. Therefore, a tradition of famous teachers with regard to instruction in any science or craft, is acknowledged to be necessary by the people of every region and generation, race. The fact that scientific instruction is a craft is also shown by the differences in technical terminologies. Every famous authority has his own technical terminology for scientific instruction, as is the case with all crafts. This shows that technical terminology is not a part of science itself. If it were, it would be one and the same with all scholars. One knows how much the technical terminology used in the teaching of speculative theology differs between the ancients and the moderns. The same applies to the principles of jurisprudence as well as to Arabic, philology, and to jurisprudence. It applies to any science one undertakes to study. The technical terminologies used in teaching it are always found to be different. This shows that the terminologies are crafts used for instruction, while each individual science as such is one and the same. If 38 this has been established, it should be known that the tradition of scientific instruction at this time has practically ceased to be cultivated among the inhabitants of the Maghrib, because the civilization of the Maghrib has disintegrated and its dynasties have lost their importance. And this has resulted in the deterioration and disappearance of the crafts. As was mentioned before, 39 Al-Qayrawan and Córdoba were centers of sedentary culture in the Maghrib and in Spain, respectively. Their civilization was highly developed, and the sciences and crafts were greatly cultivated and very much in demand in them. Since these two cities lasted a long time and possessed a sedentary culture, scientific instruction became firmly rooted in them. But when they fell into ruins, scientific instruction ceased to be cultivated. In the West, only a little of it, derived from Al-Qayrawan and Córdoba, continued to exist during the Almohad dynasty in Marrakesh. Sedentary culture, however, was not firmly rooted in Marrakesh because of the original Bedouin attitude of the Almohad dynasty and because of the shortness of time between its beginning and its destruction. Sedentary culture enjoyed only a very minor continuity there. After the destruction of the dynasty in Marrakesh, 40 in the middle of the 7th-13th century, Judge Abu I, Qasim b. Zaytun 41 travelled from Ifriqiya to the east. He entered into contact with the pupils of the Imam Ibn al-Khatib 42. He studied with them and learned their method of instruction. He became skilled in intellectual and traditional matters. Then, he returned to Tunis with a great deal of knowledge and a good method of instruction. He was followed back from the east by Abu Abdallah b. Shu'aib ad-Dukali, 43, who had travelled from the Maghrib to Ibn Zaytun. He studied with Egyptian professors and returned to Tunis, where he remained. His method of instruction was effective. The inhabitants of Tunis studied with both Ibn Zaytun and Ibn Shu'aib. Their tradition of scientific instruction was steadily continued by their pupils, generation after generation. Eventually, it reached Judge Muhammad b. Abd as-Salam, 44, the commentator and pupil of Ibn al-Hajib, 45, and was transplanted from Tunis to Tlemcen through Ibn al-Imam 46 and his pupils. Ibn al-Imam had studied with Ibn Abd as-Salam under the same professors in the same classes. Pupils of Ibn Abd as-Salam can be found at this time in Tunis, and pupils of Ibn al-Imam in Tlemcen. However, they are so few that it is to be feared that the tradition may come to an end. At the end of the 7th-13th century, Abu Ali Nasir ad-Din al-Mashadali 47 travelled eastward 48 from Zawa and got in touch with the pupils of Abu Amr b. al-Hajib. He studied with them and learned their method of instruction. He studied with Shihab ad-Din al-Qarafi 49 in the same classes. He became skilled in intellectual and traditional matters. He returned to the Maghrib with much knowledge and an effective method of instruction. He settled in Bougie. His tradition of scientific instruction was steadily continued among the students of Bougie. Imran al-Mashadali, 51 of his pupils, frequently went to Tlemcen. He settled in Tlemcen and propagated his method there. At this time, in Tlemcen and Bougie, his pupils are few, very few. Fez and the other cities of the Maghrib have been without good instruction since the destruction of scientific instruction in Córdoba and Al-Qayrawan. There has been no continuous tradition of scientific instruction in Fez. Therefore, it has been difficult for the people of Fez to obtain the scientific habit and skill. The easiest method of acquiring the scientific habit is through acquiring the ability to express oneself clearly in discussing and disputing scientific problems. This is what clarifies their import and makes them understandable. Some students spend most of their lives attending scholarly sessions. Still, one finds them silent. They do not talk and do not discuss matters. More than is necessary, they are concerned with memorizing. Thus, they do not obtain much of a habit in the practice of science and scientific instruction. Some of them think that they have obtained the habit. But when they enter into a discussion or disputation, or do some teaching, their scientific habit is found to be defective. The only reason for their deficiency is lack of instruction, together with the break in the tradition of scientific instruction, that affects them. Apart from that, their memorized knowledge may be more extensive than that of other scholars, because they are so much concerned with memorizing. They think that scientific habit is identical with memorized knowledge. But that is not so. This is attested in the Maghrib, in Morocco, by the fact that the period specified for the residence of students in college there is 16 years, while in Tunis it is 5 years. Such a fixed period of attendance is recognized as the shortest in which a student can obtain the scientific habit he desires, or can realize that he will never be able to obtain it. In the Maghrib, in Morocco, the period is so long at the present day for the very reason that the poor quality of scientific instruction there makes it difficult for the student to acquire the scientific habit, and not for any other reason. The institution of scientific instruction has disappeared among the inhabitants of Spain. Their former concern with the sciences is gone, because Muslim civilization in Spain has been decreasing for hundreds of years. The only scholarly discipline remaining there is Arabic, philology, and literature, to which the Spanish Muslims restrict themselves. The tradition of teaching these disciplines is preserved among them, and thus the disciplines as such are preserved. Jurisprudence is an empty institution among them and a mere shadow of its real self. Of the intellectual disciplines, not even a shadow remains. The only reason for that is that the tradition of scientific instruction has ceased to be cultivated in Spain, because civilization there has deteriorated and the enemy has gained control over most of it. Except for a few people along the coast who are more concerned with making a living than with the things that come after it. God has the power to execute His commands. 51. In 52 the East, the tradition of scientific instruction has not ceased to be cultivated. Scientific instruction is very much in demand and greatly cultivated in the East, because of the continuity of an abundant civilization and the continuity of the tradition of scientific instruction there. It is true that the old cities, such as Baghdad, Al-Basra, and Al-Kufa, which were the original mines of scholarship, are in ruins. However, God has replaced them with cities even greater than they were. Science was transplanted from the early centers to the non-Arab Iraq of Khorasan, to Transoxania in the east, and to Cairo and adjacent regions in the west. These cities have never ceased to have an abundant and continuous civilization, and the tradition of scientific instruction has always persisted in them. The inhabitants of the East are, in general, more firmly rooted in the craft of scientific instruction and, indeed, in all the other crafts, than Macribes. In fact, many Macribes who have traveled to the East in quest of knowledge, have been of the opinion that 53 the intellect of the people of the East is, in general, more perfect than that of the Macribes. They have supposed the rational souls, of the people of the East, to be by nature more perfect than those of the Macribes. They have claimed that there exists a difference in the reality of humanity between ourselves, the Macribes, and them, 54 because their cleverness in the sciences and crafts seemed remarkable to them. This is not so. There is no difference between the East and the West great enough to be considered a difference in the reality of human nature, which is one and the same everywhere. Such a difference does in fact exist in the intemperate zones, such as the 1st and the 7th zones. The tempers there are intemperate, and the souls are correspondingly intemperate, as has been mentioned before. 55 The superiority of the inhabitants of the East over those of the West lies in the additional intelligence that accrues to the soul from the influences of sedentary culture. As has been stated before in connection with the crafts. 56 We are now going to comment on that and to verify it. It is as follows. Sedentary people observe a particular code of manners in everything they undertake and do or do not do, and they thus acquire certain ways of making a living, finding dwellings, building houses, and handling their religious and worldly matters, including their customary affairs, their dealings with others, and all the rest of their activities. 57 These manners constitute a kind of limitation which may not be transgressed, and, at the same time, they are crafts that, later, generations take over from the earlier ones. No doubt, each craft that has its proper place within the arrangement of the crafts, influences the soul and causes it to acquire an additional intelligence, which prepares the soul for accepting still other crafts. The intellect is thus conditioned for a quick reception of knowledge. We hear that the Egyptians have achieved things hardly possible in the teaching of the crafts. For instance, they teach domestic donkeys and other dumb animals, quadrupeds and birds, to speak words and to do things that are remarkable for their rarity and that the inhabitants of the Maghrib would not be capable of understanding, let alone teaching. 58. Good habits in scientific instruction, in the crafts, and in all the other customary activities, add insight to the intellect of a man and enlightenment to his thinking, since the soul thus obtains a great number of habits. We have stated before. 59 That the soul grows under the influence of the perceptions it receives and the habits accruing to it. Thus, the people of the East become more clever, because their souls are influenced by scientific activity. The common people then suppose that it is a difference in the reality of humanity. This is not so. If one compares sedentary people with Bedouins, one notices how much more insight and cleverness sedentary people have. One might, thus, come to think that they really differ from the Bedouins in the reality of humanity and in intelligence. This is not so. The only reason for the difference is that sedentary people have refined technical habits and manners as far as customary activities and sedentary conditions are concerned, all of them things that are unknown to the Bedouins. Sedentary people possess numerous crafts, as well as the habits that go with them, and good methods of teaching the crafts. Therefore, those who do not have such habits think that they indicate an intellectual perfection possessed, exclusively, by sedentary people, and that the natural qualifications of the Bedouins are inferior to those of sedentary people. This is not so. We find Bedouins whose understanding, intellectual perfection, and natural qualifications are of the highest rank. The seeming superiority of sedentary people is merely the result of a certain polish the crafts and scientific instruction give them. It influences the soul, as we have stated before. 60 Now, the inhabitants of the East are more firmly grounded and more advanced in scientific instruction and the crafts, than the Maghribis, and the Maghribis are closer to desert life. As we have stated before in the preceding section. 61 This leads superficial people to think that the inhabitants of the East are distinguished from the Maghribis by a certain perfection of theirs, touching the reality of humanity. That is not correct, as one should be able to understand. God gives in addition to the creatures whatever He wishes to give to them. 62. 8. The sciences are numerous only where civilization is large and sedentary culture highly developed. 63. The reason for this is that scientific instruction, as we have just stated, is one of the crafts. We have also stated before that the crafts are numerous only in cities. The quality and the number of the crafts depend on the greater or lesser extent of civilization in the cities and on the sedentary culture and luxury they enjoy, because highly developed crafts are something additional to just making a living. When civilized people have more labor available than they need for mere subsistence, such surplus labor is used for activities over and above making a living. 64 These activities are man's prerogative. They are the sciences and the crafts. People who grow up in villages and uncivilized, thinly populated cities and who have an innate desire for scientific activity, cannot find scientific instruction in those places. For scientific instruction is something technical, and there are no crafts among the inhabitants of the desert, as we have stated before. 65 These people, therefore, must travel and seek scientific instruction in cities where civilization is highly developed, as is the case with all crafts. This may be exemplified by our previous statements. 66 Concerning Baghdad, Cordoba, Al-Qayrawan, Al-Basra, and Al-Kufa. At the beginning of Islam, the civilizations, populations, were large, and sedentary culture existed in them. The sciences were then greatly cultivated there, and the people were widely versed in the various technical terminologies of scientific instruction, in the different kinds of sciences, and in posing problems and inventing new disciplines. They exceeded all who had come before them and surpassed all who came after them. But when the civilization of those cities decreased and their inhabitants were dispersed, the picture was completely reversed. Science and scientific instruction no longer existed in those cities, but were transplanted to other Muslim cities. We, at this time, notice that science and scientific instruction exist in Cairo in Egypt, because the civilization of Egypt is greatly developed and its sedentary culture has been well established for thousands of years. Therefore, the crafts are firmly established there and exist in many varieties. One of them is scientific instruction. This state of affairs has been strengthened and preserved in Egypt by the events of the last 200 years under the Turkish dynasty, from the days of Salah ad-Din Ayyub on. This is because the Turkish emirs under the Turkish dynasty were afraid that their ruler might proceed against the descendants they would leave behind, inasmuch as they were his slaves or clients, and because chicanery and confiscation are always to be feared from royal authority. Therefore, they built a great many colleges, hermitages, and monasteries, 67, and endowed them with mortmain endowments that yielded income. They saw to it that their children would participate in these endowments, either as administrators or by having some other share in them. This was their intention, in addition to the fact that they were inclined to do good deeds and hoped for a heavenly reward for their aspirations and actions. As a consequence, mortmain endowments became numerous, and the income and profit from them increased. Students and teachers increased in numbers, because a large number of stipends became available from the endowments. People traveled to Egypt from the Iraq and the Maghrib in quest of knowledge. Thus, the sciences were very much in demand and greatly cultivated there. 68. God creates whatever He wishes. 69. 9. The various sciences that exist in contemporary civilization. It should be known that the sciences with which people concern themselves in cities and which they acquire and pass on through instruction, are of two kinds, one that is natural to man and to which he is guided by his own ability to think, and a traditional kind that he learns from those who invented it. The first kind comprises the philosophical sciences. They are the ones with which man can become acquainted through the very nature of his ability to think and to whose objects, problems, arguments, and methods of instruction he is guided by his human perceptions. So that he is made aware of the distinction between what is correct and what is wrong in them by his own speculation and research, inasmuch as he is a thinking human being. The second kind comprises the traditional, conventional sciences. All of them depend upon information based on the authority of the given religious law. There is no place for the intellect in them, save that the intellect may be used in connection with them to relate problems of detail with basic principles. Particulars that constantly come into being are not included in the general tradition by the mere fact of its existence. Therefore, they need to be related to the general principles by some kind of analogical reasoning. However, such analogical reasoning is derived from the traditional information, while the character of the basic principle, which is traditional, remains valid, unchanged. Thus, analogical reasoning of this type reverts to being tradition itself, because it is derived from it. 70. The basis of all the traditional sciences is the legal material of the Quran and the Sunnah, which is the law given us by God and His Messenger, as well as the sciences connected with that material, by means of which we are enabled to utilize it. This, further, requires as auxiliary sciences the sciences of the Arabic language. Arabic is the language of Islam, and the Quran was revealed in it. The different kinds of traditional sciences are numerous, because it is the duty of the responsible Muslim to know the legal obligations God placed upon him and upon his fellow men. They are derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, either from the text, or through general consensus, or through combination. Thus, he must first study the explicit wording of the Quran. This is the science of Quran interpretation. Then, he must study the Quran, both with reference to the manner in which it has been transmitted and related on the authority of the Prophet who brought it from God, and with reference to the differences in the readings of the Quran readers. This is the science of Quran reading. Then, he must study the manner in which the Sunnah is related to its originator, Muhammad, and he must discuss the transmitters who have handed it down. He must know their circumstances and their probity, so that the information one receives from them may be trusted and so that one may be able to know the part of it, in accordance with the implications of which one must act. 71. These are the sciences of tradition. Then, the process of evolving the laws from their basic principles requires some normative guidance to provide us with the knowledge of how that process takes place. This is the science of the principles of jurisprudence. After one knows the principles of jurisprudence, one can enjoy, as its result, the knowledge of the divine laws that govern the actions of all responsible Muslims. This is jurisprudence. Furthermore, the duties of the Muslim may concern either the body or the heart. The duties of the heart are concerned with faith and the distinction between what is to be believed and what is not to be believed. This concerns the articles of faith which deal with the essence and attributes of God, the events of the resurrection, paradise, punishment, and predestination, and entails discussion and defense of these subjects with the help of intellectual arguments. This is speculative theology. The discussion of the Quran and Hadith must be preceded by the study of the philological sciences, because it is based upon them. There are various kinds, such as lexicography, grammar, syntax and style, 72 and literature. We shall discuss each of these. These traditional sciences are all restricted to Islam and the Muslims, even though every religious group has to have something of the sort. The traditional sciences of Islam are remotely comparable to those of other religious groups, in that they are sciences of a religious law revealed by God to the lawgiver who transmits it. But as to the particulars, Islam is different from all other religious groups, because it abrogates them. All the pre-Islamic sciences concerned with religious groups are to be discarded, and their discussion is forbidden. The religious law has forbidden the study of all revealed scriptures except the Quran. Muhammad said, "Consider the people of the book neither as truthful nor as untruthful. Just say, we believe in what was revealed to us and revealed to you. Our God and your God are one." 73. And when the Prophet saw a leaf of the Torah in Umar's hand, he got so angry that his anger showed in his face. Then, he said, "Did I not bring it to you white and clean? By God, if Moses were alive, he would have no choice but to follow me." 74. The traditional legal sciences were cultivated in Islam in a way that permitted no further increase. The students of those sciences reached the farthest possible limit in knowledge of them. The various technical terminologies were refined, and order was brought into the various disciplines. The traditional sciences thus achieved exceeding excellence and refinement. Each discipline had its authorities to whom one referred, and its rules that were used for instruction. The West as well as the East had its share of famous traditional scholarship, as we are shortly going to mention, when we enumerate these disciplines. At this time, however, science is at a standstill in the Maghrib, because civilization has decreased there and the tradition of science and scientific instruction has broken off. As we stated in the preceding section 75, I do not know what God has done with the East. The assumption is that science is very much cultivated there and that the teaching of the sciences and of all necessary and luxury crafts continues there without interruption. The civilization and sedentary culture of the East are extensive, and students find support there through stipends from Mortmain endowments which give them ample sustenance. 76. God determines night and day. 77. 10. The Quranic sciences of Quran interpretation and Quran reading. The Quran is the word of God that was revealed to his prophet and that is written down between the two covers of copies of the Quran, Mushaf. Its transmission has been continuous in Islam. However, the men around Muhammad transmitted it on the authority of the Messenger of God in different ways. These differences affect certain of the words in it and the manner in which the letters were pronounced. They were handed down and became famous. Eventually, 7 specific ways of reading the Quran became established. Transmission of the Quran readings, with their particular pronunciation, also was continuous. They came to be ascribed to certain men from among a large number of persons who had become famous as their transmitters. The 7 Quran readings became the basis for reading the Quran. Later on, other readings were occasionally added to the 7. However, they are not considered by the authorities on Quran reading to be as reliably transmitted as the 7. The 7 Quran readings are well known from books which deal with them. Certain people have contested the continuity of their transmission. In their opinion, they are ways of indicating the pronunciation, and pronunciation is something that cannot definitely be fixed. This, however, they thought not to reflect upon the continuity of the transmission of the Quran. The majority did not admit their view. They asserted the continuity of the transmission of the 7 readings. Others asserted the continuity of all 7, except with regard to the fine points of pronunciation, such as the longer pronunciation of the long vowels and the weakening of the aleph. 78 Because the ear is not able to determine how it must be done. This is the correct opinion. Quran readers continued to circulate and transmit those readings, until the sciences were fixed in writing and treated systematically. Those readings, then, were set down in writing, along with the other sciences, and became a special craft and science in itself. People in the East and in Spain handed them down generation after generation. Eventually, Mujahid, a client of the Emirates, 79 became ruler of eastern Spain. He concerned himself with this particular Quranic discipline, because he was held to it by his master, Al-Mansur b. Abi Amir, who made every effort to instruct him in it, and to have him study it, with the authoritative Quran readers at his court. Thus, he acquired a very good knowledge of it. Later on, Mujahid became Emir of Dinaya and the eastern islands, the Balears. As a result, the reading of the Quran was greatly cultivated there, because he was an authority in it and because he was much concerned with all sciences in general and with the reading of the Quran in particular. In his time, there appeared Abu Amr ad-Dani 80. He achieved the greatest perfection in the reading of the Quran. The knowledge of it rests with him, and its transmission in its entirety goes through him. He composed numerous works on the subject, which became the authoritative works, and people no longer consulted anyone else. 81 Among ad-Dani's works, the Kitab at-Taysir became the general reference work. In the times and generations closely following that, there appeared Abul 82. Qasim b. Farah, Ash-Shatibi, of Jaitiva. He set out to correct and abridge the systematic works of Abu Amr ad-Din. He versified the whole material in a poem in which he referred cryptically to the names of the Quran readers by the letters of the alphabet, according to his own arrangement. His purpose was to be as brief as he could be and to make the subject easier to memorize by means of the rhymed form. He skillfully compressed the whole subject in his poem. People undertook to memorize it and to teach it to children studying the subject. That was the practice in the cities of the Maghrib and Spain. The discipline of Quran readings is often extended to include also the discipline of Quran orthography, razm, which deals with usage of the letters in copies of the Quran and with the orthography of the Quran. The Quran contains many letters that are used differently than is usual in writing. There is, for instance, the addition of the Y in Ba'idin with hands, power, 83 the addition of the Aleph in La'ad Bahane I shall indeed slaughter him 84 and in Wa La'ada U and, indeed, they would walk swiftly, 85 the addition of the W in Jaza Uwz Limina. The sinner's reward, 86 and the omission of the Aleph in some places and not in others. Then, there are the Is that are written in the Quran with the letter T, while they should be written with the H with 2 dots over it, and other things. An explanation of Quranic orthography was given earlier in connection with the discussion of writing 87. When the divergences in the usage and norm of writing made their appearance, it became necessary to deal with them comprehensively. Therefore, they, too, were written down, when scholars fixed the sciences in writing. In the West, they reached the aforementioned Abu Amr ad-Dani. He wrote a number of books about them, the best known being the Kitab al-Mughni. People took up the book and employed it as a reference work. Abul Qasim, B. Farah, Ash-Shatibi versified the Kitab al-Mughni in his famous poem rhyming on R. People eagerly memorized that poem. Then, there were more orthographic divergences which concerned other words and letters. These words and letters were mentioned by Abu Dayyad Sulaiman b. Najat, 88 a client of Mujahid, in his works. He was a pupil of Abu Amr ad-Dani, and famous for the fact that he preserved ad-Dani's learning and transmitted his works. After him, other divergences came up. A modern Maghribi scholar, Al-Kharaz, 89 composed another Rajaz poem. In it, he added many divergences to those of the Muqni. He indicated, in each instance, who their transmitters were. This poem became famous in the Maghrib. People now memorized only it, and they discarded in its favor the works of Abu Dayyad, Abu Amr, and Ash-Shatibi on Quran orthography 90. Quran interpretation. It should be known that the Quran was revealed in the language of the Arabs and according to their rhetorical methods. All Arabs understood it and knew the meaning of the individual words and composite statements. It was revealed in chapters and verses, in order to explain the oneness of God and the religious duties according to the various occasions. Some passages of the Quran concern articles of faith. Others concern the duties of the limbs of the body. Some are early and are followed by other, later passages that abrogate the earlier ones. The Prophet used to explain these things, as it is said, so that you may explain to the people that which was revealed to them. 91 He used to explain the unclear statements, in the Quran, 92 and to distinguish the abrogating statements from those abrogated by them. And to inform the men around him in this sense. The men around him, thus, became acquainted with the subject. They knew why individual verses had been revealed, and the situation that had required them, directly on Muhammad's authority. Thus, the verse of the Quran, when God's help comes and the victory, 93 refers to the announcement of the Prophet's death, and similar things. These explanations were transmitted on the authority of the men around Muhammad and were circulated by the men of the second generation after them on their authority. They continued to be transmitted among the early Muslims, until knowledge became organized in scholarly disciplines and systematic scholarly works were written. At that time, most of these explanations were committed to writing. The traditional information concerning them, which had come down from the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation, was transmitted farther. That material reached at-Tabari, al-Waqidi, Atha Alibi, 94 and other current interpreters. They committed to writing as much of the traditional information as God wanted them to do. The linguistic sciences then became technical discussions of the lexicographical meaning of words, the rules governing vowel endings, i'rab, and style, balagha, in the use of word combinations. Systematic works were written on these subjects. Formerly, these subjects had been habits with the Arabs. 95 No recourse to oral and written transmission had been necessary with respect to them. Now, that state of affairs was forgotten, and these subjects were learned from the books of philologists. They were needed for the interpretation of the Quran, because the Quran is in Arabic and follows the stylistic technique of the Arabs. Quran interpretation thus came to be handled in two ways. One kind of Quran interpretation is traditional. It is based upon information received from the early Muslims. It consists of knowledge of the abrogating verses and of the verses that are abrogated by them, of the reasons why a given verse was revealed, and of the purposes of individual verses. All this can be known only through traditions based on the authority of the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation. The early scholars had already made complete compilations on the subject. However, their works and the information they transmit contain side by side important and unimportant matters, accepted and rejected statements. The reason is that the Arabs had no books or scholarship. The desert attitude and illiteracy prevailed among them. When they wanted to know certain things that human beings are usually curious to know, such as the reasons for the existing things, the beginning of creation, and the secrets of existence, they consulted the earlier people of the book about it and got their information from them. The people of the book were the Jews who had the Torah, and the Christians who followed the religion of the Jews. Now, the people of the Torah who lived among the Arabs at that time were themselves Bedouins. They knew only as much about these matters as is known to ordinary people of the book, in contrast to learned rabbis. 96 The majority of those Jews were Himyarites who had adopted Judaism. When they became Muslims, they clung to the information they possessed, such as information about the beginning of creation and information of the type of forecasts and predictions. That information had no connection with the Jewish or Christian religious laws they were preserving as theirs. Such men were Kansas B. al-Abar, 97 Wab B. Munabi, 98 Abdallah B. Salim, 99 and similar people. The Quran commentaries were filled with material of such tendencies transmitted on their authority. It is information that entirely depends on them. It has no relation to religious laws, such that one might claim for it the soundness that would make it necessary to act in accordance with it. The Quran interpreters were not very rigorous in this respect. They filled the Quran commentaries with such material, which originated, as we have stated, with the people of the Torah who lived in the desert and were not capable of verifying the information they transmitted. However, they were famous and highly esteemed, because they were people of rank in their religion and religious group. Therefore, their interpretation has been accepted from that time onwards. Later, scholars applied themselves to verification and critical investigation. Abu Muhammad b. Atiyah, 100 a recent Maghribi scholar, made his appearance. He abridged all the commentaries and selected the most likely interpretations. He set that material down in a good book, which is in general circulation among the inhabitants of the Maghrib and of Spain. Al-Qurtubi 101 adopted his method in this respect in another work, which is well known in the East. The other kind of Quran interpretation has recourse to linguistic knowledge, such as lexicography 102 and the stylistic form, balagha, used for conveying meaning through the appropriate means and methods 103. This kind of Quran interpretation rarely appears separately from the first kind. The first kind is the one that is wanted essentially. The second kind made its appearance only after language and the philological sciences had become crafts. However, it has become preponderant, as far as certain Quran commentaries are concerned. The commentary in which this discipline is best represented is the Kitab al-Kashaf by Aziz Zamakhshari, 104 of Khwarizm in the Iraq. However, its author is a Mu'tazila in his dogmatic views. Therefore, he uses the various methods of rhetoric, balagha, arguing in favor of the pernicious doctrines of the Mu'tazila, wherever he believed they occurred in the verses of the Quran. Competent orthodox scholars have, therefore, come to disregard his work and to warn everyone against its pitfalls. However, they admit that he is on firm ground in everything relating to language and style, balagha. If the student of the work is acquainted with the orthodox dogmas and knows the arguments in their defense, he is no doubt safe from its fallacies. Therefore, he should seize the opportunity to study it, because it contains remarkable and varied linguistic information. 105. Recently, a work by an Iraqi scholar, Sharaf ad-Din at-Tibi, 106 of Tabriz in the non-Arab Iraq, has reached us. It is a commentary on the work of Aziz Zamakhshari. At-Tibi follows Aziz Zamakhshari's work literally, but opposes its Mu'tazila dogmas and arguments, showing their lack of validity and, always, explaining that an eloquent style exists in a given verse but it reflects the opinions of Orthodox Muslims, and not the dogmas of the Mu'tazila. He does that very well, and he also possesses all the various disciplines of rhetoric, balagha. And he knows more than any scholar. 107. 11. The sciences concerned with prophetic traditions. The sciences concerned with prophetic traditions, hadith, are numerous and varied. One of them concerns abrogating and abrogated traditions. The permission to abrogate previous statements, and the occurrence of abrogation have been established in our religious law. It is a favor shown by God to His servants and a kind of relief granted them to help them along in matters affecting their well-being, masali, for which He is responsible to them. God said, "Whenever we abrogate a verse or consign it to oblivion, we bring one that is better, or as good." 108. The 109 knowledge of abrogating and abrogated verses belongs both to the Quran and to the traditions. Everything about abrogation, as far as it concerns the Quran, is included in the Quran commentaries. Whatever is restricted to traditions falls under the sciences of tradition. Two traditions may be mutually exclusive, and it may be difficult to reconcile them with the help of interpretation. If, in such a case, it is known that one is earlier than the other, it is definite that the later tradition abrogates the earlier one. This is one of the most important and difficult of the sciences of tradition. Az-Zuhri 110 said, "It has been a baffling and impossible task for the jurists to distinguish traditions of the Messenger of God abrogating others, from those that were abrogated by them." Ash-Shafi'i was firmly grounded in this subject. Another 111 of the sciences of tradition is the knowledge of the norms that leading hadith scholars have invented in order to know the chains of transmitters, the individual transmitters, their names, how the transmission took place, their conditions, their classes, and their different technical terminologies. This is because general consensus makes it obligatory to act in accordance with information established on the authority of the Messenger of God. This requires probability for the assumption that the information is true. Thus, the independent student must verify all the means by which it is possible to make such an assumption. He may do this by scrutinizing the chains of transmitters of traditions. For that purpose, one may use such knowledge of the probity, accuracy, thoroughness, and lack of carelessness or negligence, as the most reliable Muslims describe a transmitter as possessing. Then, there are the differences in rank that exist among transmitters. Further, there is the way the transmission took place. The transmitter may have heard the sheikh dictate the tradition, or he may have read it from a book, in his presence, or he may have heard it read in the presence of the sheikh and the sheikh may have written it down for him. Or he may have obtained the approval of the sheikh for written material, munawala, or he may have obtained his permission to teach certain traditions, ijaza. Then, there is the difference with regard to the degree of soundness or acceptability of the transmitted material. 112 The highest grade of transmitted material is called sound by the hadith scholars. Next comes good. The lowest grade is weak. The classification of traditions includes also skipping the first transmitter on Muhammad's authority, mursal, omitting one link, munqati, omitting two links, mudal, affected by some infirmity, mu'allal, singular, shad, unusual, garab, and singular and suspect, munkar. 113 In some cases, there is a difference of opinion as to whether traditions so described should be rejected. In other cases, there is general agreement that they should be rejected. The same is 114 the case with traditions with sound chains. In some cases, there is general agreement as to their acceptability and soundness, whereas, in other cases, there are differences of opinion. Hadith scholars differ greatly in their explanations of these terms. Then, there follows the discussion of terms applying to the texts of the traditions. A text may be unusual, garab, difficult, ambiguous, mushkil, affected by some misspelling, or misreading, or containing homonyms, muftarik, or containing homographs, muqtalij. 116. On 117 all these points, hadith scholars have laid down a canon explaining the various grades and terms, and adequate to protect the transmission from possible defects. The first outstanding hadith scholar to lay down such a canon was Abu Abdallah al-Hakim. 118 He improved it and presented it to its best advantage. His works on the subject are famous. Other leading hadith scholars followed him and wrote works on the subject. The most famous work by a modern scholar on the subject is the book of Abu Amr as-Salah. 119 He lived in the early part of the 7th–13th century. His example was followed by Muhyiddin an-Nawawi. 120 The purpose of the discipline is a noble one. It is concerned with the knowledge of how to preserve the traditions, sunan, transmitted on the authority of the master of the religious law, Muhammad, until it is definite which are to be accepted and which are to be rejected. It should be known that the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation who transmitted the Sunnah were well known in the cities of Islam. There were transmitters in the Hijaz, in Al-Basra and Al-Kufa, and then in Syria and Egypt. They were famous in their time. The transmitters of the Hijaz had fewer links in their chains of transmitters than others, and they were sounder transmitters, because they were reluctant to accept, as reliable transmitters, those who were obscure and whose conditions were not known. After the early Muslims, the master of the Hijazi tradition was the Imam Malik, the leading scholar of Medina. Then came his colleagues, such as the Imam Muhammad b. Idris ash-Shafi'i, Ibn Wahb, 121 Ibn Bukair 122 Al-Qanabi 123. Muhammad b. Al-Hasan 124 and after them, the Imam Ahmad b. Hanbal, and other later scholars. At the beginning, knowledge of the religious law was entirely based on oral tradition. It involved no speculation, no use of opinion, and no intricate reasoning. 125 The early Muslims occupied themselves with it, selecting the sound material, and thus eventually perfected it. Malik wrote the Kitab al-Muwatta according to the Hijazi tradition, 126 in which he laid down the principal laws on the basis of sound, generally agreed upon, material. He arranged the work according to juridical categories. The hadith experts concerned themselves with knowledge of the recensions of traditions and of the different chains of transmitters, such 127 as the Hijazi and the Iraqi transmissions and others. A certain tradition may be known in one way only or in numerous ways, and it may be repeated in different chapters of works of jurisprudence, because it deals with several subjects. There was Muhammad b. Ismail al-Bukhari, the leading hadith scholar of his time. In his Musnad as-Sahih, he widened the area of tradition and 128 published the orthodox traditions arranged according to subject. He combined all the different ways of the Hijazis, Iraqis, and Syrians, accepting the material upon which they all agreed, but excluding the material concerning which there were differences of opinion. He repeated a given tradition in every chapter upon which the contents of that particular tradition had some bearing. Therefore, his traditions were repeated in several chapters, because a single tradition may deal with different subjects, as we have indicated. His work thus comprised 7,200 traditions, 129 of which 3,000 are repeated. In each chapter, he kept separate the recensions with the different chains of transmitters belonging to them. Then came the Imam Muslim b. al-Hajjaj al-Kashari. He composed his Musnad as-Sahih, in which he followed al-Bukhari, in that he transmitted the material that was generally agreed upon, but he omitted the repetitions and did not keep the recensions and chains of transmitters separate. He arranged his work according to juridical categories and the chapter headings of jurisprudence. Scholars have corrected the two authors, noting the cases of the sound traditions not included in their works. 130 They have mentioned the cases where they neglected to include traditions which, according to the conditions governing the inclusion of traditions in their works, should have been included. Abu Dayyad as-Sijistani, Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi, and Abu Abdar Rahman and Nasa'i 131 wrote Sunan works which included more than merely sound traditions. Their intention was to include all traditions that amply fulfilled the conditions making them actionable traditions. They were either traditions with few links in the chain of transmitters, which makes them sound traditions, as is generally acknowledged, or they were lesser traditions, such as good traditions and others. It was to serve as a guide to orthodox practice. These 132 are the collections of traditions that are used as reference works in Islam. They are the chief orthodox works on traditions. Other collections have been added to these five, such as the Musnads of Abu Dayyad at-Tayalisi, 133 al-Bazar, 134 Abd Humayd, 135 ad-Darimi, 136 Abu Yalain al-Mawzili, 137 and the Imam Ahmad. According to Ibn as-Salah, their intention was to collect the material transmitted on the authority of the men around Muhammad that cannot be used as argument. However, it has been transmitted on the authority of the Imam Ahmad, that he used to say to his son Abdallah concerning his own Musnad, which includes 31,000 traditions, and the same statement by Ahmad is also transmitted, in the same words, on the authority of a number of his companions, who said that he had instructed them in his Musnad. This work is a selection from among 750,000 traditions. The prophetic traditions concerning which the Muslims hold divergent opinions, of their genuineness, and which you do not find in it, cannot be used as arguments. This shows that all the material in his Musnad can properly be used as argument. This is the opposite of what has been said by Ibn as-Salah. I have quoted Ahmad's statement from the Manaqib al-Imam Ahmad by Ibn al-Jawzi. 138. At this time, traditions are no longer published, nor are they publications of traditions by former scholars corrected. Common experience attests the fact that these numerous religious leaders, close to each other in time, were too capable and too firmly possessed of independent judgment to have neglected or omitted any. 140. Tradition, so that it is impossible that some later scholar might discover one. Therefore, at this time, one is concerned with correcting the principal written works, with fixing the accuracy of their transmission, and 141 with establishing continuous chains of transmitters leading back to the authors, chains that are sound throughout. With very few exceptions, no attention has been paid to more than the five main works. Al-Bukhari's Sahih occupies the highest rank among them. People have considered it difficult to comment on the Sahih and have found it rather complicated, because it requires a knowledge of numerous recensions and personages from the Hijaz, Syria, and the Iraq, as well as knowledge of their conditions and of the different opinions of scholars about them. Constant study is also required to understand the subject headings. Al-Bukhari would make a chapter heading and mention under it a tradition with a certain chain of transmitters or in a certain recension. Then, he would make another subject heading and mention the very same tradition under it, because it, also, deals with the subject of that particular chapter. This applies to every chapter heading, so that the tradition may be repeated in separate 142 chapters according to the various different subjects it deals with. A study 143 of the chapter headings should clearly indicate the relation that exists between them and the traditions the chapter contains. However, in many cases, this relation is obscure, and people have lengthily tried to explain it. This happened in connection with the chapter heading, "The house will be destroyed by an Abyssinian with 2 little legs." 144. It occurs in the book on disturbances, Fitan. Then, Al-Bukhari quotes the Quran, "And when we made the house a meeting place for the people and a place of safety." 145. Nothing is said of the matter mentioned in the chapter heading, and the relationship between the chapter heading and the chapter has remained obscure to scholars. Some have said that the author wrote all the chapter headings down in his draft and wrote the traditions under each chapter heading later, whenever he had the opportunity. He died before he was able to fill in all the chapter headings, and his work was transmitted in this, incomplete form. However, as I learned from the companions of Judge Ibn Bakr, 146, the judge of Granada who died in the Battle of Tarifa in the year 741 1340, 147, and who was well versed in Diana, the Sahih of al-Bukhari. The chapter heading, quoted, was intended by al-Bukhari to interpret the verse of the Quran in the sense that it dealt with something established by law, and not with something appointed by divine decree. 148. The difficulty results from interpreting "we made" in the sense of "we appointed by divine decree." If the word in question is interpreted in the sense of "we established by law," there is no confusion, or contradiction, in the chapter heading saying that a man with 2 little legs will destroy the house. I learned this explanation from our teacher, Abul Barakat al-Balafiqi, 149, who had it on the authority of Ibn Bakr. Al-Balafiqi was one of his most important pupils. Commentators who do not exhaust such problems do not completely fulfill their duties as commentators. Commentators of this sort include Ibn Battal, 150, Ibn al-Muhallab, 151, Ibn at-Tin, 152, and others. I have heard many of our teachers say, the Muslims still have the obligation to write a commentary on al-Bukhari. They meant that no Muslim scholar has so far completely fulfilled the task of a commentator in the sense indicated. The Sahih of Muslim has been given much attention by Maghribi scholars. They applied themselves to it and agreed that it was superior to the work of al-Bukhari. Ibn as-Salah said, 153, it is considered superior, by Maghribis and other scholars, to the work of al-Bukhari, because it is free from admixtures of material that is not sound and that al-Bukhari wrote down disregarding his own conditions of soundness, mostly in connection with the chapter headings. The Imam al-Mazari, 154, a Malikite jurist, dictated a commentary on the Sahih of Muslim which he entitled Al-Mulim bi Fawaid Muslim. It contains much important source material from the science of tradition and solid juridical knowledge. The work was later on perfected by Judge Iyad 155. He called his work Ikmal al-Mulim. The two of them were followed by Muhyiddin an-Nawal with a commentary containing all the material of the two works and adding to it, thus becoming a complete commentary. The other three collections of traditions contain the most extensive source material for jurists. Most comment on that material is found in the logbooks, except for those things that are peculiar to the science of tradition. Scholars wrote on that material, and exhaustively presented in this respect as much as was needed of the sciences of tradition, their subjects, and the collections which contain traditions considered norms for action. It should be known that, at this time, traditions are classified in grade as sound, good, weak, ill, and so on. The classification was fixed and made known by the leading hadith authorities. It is no longer possible to declare a tradition sound, that had not been known as sound before. The hadith authorities made known the traditions in their various recensions and with their chains of transmitters. They were so thorough in this respect that, if a tradition had been transmitted with a chain of transmitters or in a recension not belonging to it, they would have realized that it had been tampered with. Something of the sort happened to the Imam Muhammad b. Ismail 156 al-Bukhari. He came to Baghdad, and the hadith scholars wanted to examine him. They asked him about several traditions, transposing the chains of transmitters, cited. He said, "I do not know those traditions, but I was told by so and so." And then he repeated all the traditions in the correct order, supplying each text with the chain of transmitters to which it belonged. The hadith scholars, in Baghdad, in consequence, acknowledged al-Bukhari's leadership 157. It should also be known that religious leaders of independent judgment differed in the extent of their knowledge of traditions. It is said that the number of traditions that Abu Hanifa transmitted came to only 17 or so. 158 Malik accepted as sound only the traditions found in the Muwatta. They are at most 300 or so. Ahmad b. Hanbal has 50,159 traditions in his Musnad. Each authority has as many traditions as his independent judgment in this respect allowed him to have. A certain biased, unfair person dared to say that some of the authorities knew little about traditions and, therefore, did not transmit many. It is impossible to believe such a thing about the great religious leaders. The religious law is derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, and those who know little about traditions definitely have to study and transmit them with eagerness and zeal. In order to be able to derive the religion from its sound basic principles and to get the laws from their master, Muhammad, who brought them from God. Therefore, the great religious leaders who transmitted only a few traditions, did so, not because they knew little about traditions but, because they might have been attacked with regard to the traditions they transmitted, and because their transmission might have been accused of defects. Especially since the majority of scholars gives preference to negative, as against positive, personality criticism. Therefore, their independent judgment induced them to leave aside traditions and chains of transmitters in which such defects might occur and which are numerous. Therefore, they transmitted few traditions, because of the weakness of the ways of transmission. Furthermore, the Hijazis transmitted more traditions than the Iraqis. Medina was the place to which Muhammad emigrated and where the men around him made their home. Those of them who moved to the Iraq were more occupied with the Holy War, than with the transmission of traditions. The Imam Abu Hanifa transmitted only a few traditions, because he was very strict in applying the conditions governing the transmission and retention of traditions. He declared traditions weak when they were contradicted by decisive logical arguments. Therefore, it was difficult for him to transmit traditions, and his traditions are few. However, it can by no means be assumed that he purposely omitted to transmit traditions. He would not have done such a thing. He was one of the greatest scholars of independent judgment in the science of tradition. This is proven by the fact that the hadith scholars follow his school and refer to it and take it into consideration in rejecting or accepting arguments. Other hadith scholars, that is, the great majority, permitted a certain latitude in applying the conditions governing the soundness of traditions. They transmitted many traditions, everyone relying on his own independent judgment. The later, Hanafites, permitted a certain latitude in applying the conditions and transmitted many traditions. At-Tahawi 160 was a transmitter who transmitted many traditions. He wrote his Musnad, which is an important work. However, it does not have the same value as the two Sahihs, because the conditions applied by al-Bukhari and Muslim in their works are those accepted by the general consensus of all Muslims, as has been said. The conditions applied by at-Taha'i, on the other hand, are not generally agreed upon. For instance, he transmits traditions on the authority of persons whose condition is obscure, and other things. Therefore, the two Sahihs, as, indeed, the other well-known collections of traditions, are preferable to at-Taha'i, because his conditions are inferior to theirs. Therefore it is said that the two Sahihs are accepted by general consensus, as there is general consensus concerning the soundness of the conditions applied in them and generally agreed upon. No one should be in any doubt about this. Of all people, scholars most deserve that one have a good opinion of them and that one be eager to find sound excuses for them. Another 161 of the sciences of traditions is the application of this canon to the discussion of the traditions, one by one, according to their various chapters and headings, by interpreting these collections of traditions. 162 This was done by the hadith expert Abu Umar b. Abd al-Bar, 163 by Abu Muhammad b. Hazm, 164 by Judge Iyad, by Muhyiddin an-Nawawi, and by Ibn al-Attar 165 after, Iyad and an-Nawawi, and by many other leading religious scholars of the West and the East. It is true that their discussions of the traditions contain other things, such as things that have to do with the text, the lexicography, and the grammar, Irab, of the traditions. Still, their discussions of the chains of transmitters of the traditions in accordance with the hadith technique, are more comprehensive and longer, than their discussions of other matters. These are the various sciences of tradition current among leading contemporary authorities. 166. God guides toward the truth and helps to find it. Another of the sciences of tradition is that concerned with the chains of transmitters and with knowledge of the traditions in accordance with which one must act because they are provided with chains of transmitters fulfilling all the conditions of trustworthiness. One must act only in accordance with those traditions of the Messenger of God that, in all probability, are true. How it is possible to assume probability must be investigated by independent study. One gets to the assumption of probability through knowledge of the probity and accuracy of the transmitters of traditions. Such knowledge is established through information obtained on the authority of religious leaders, which declares a transmitter to be reliable and free from unreliability or negligence. This shows us whether we should accept their traditions or reject them. Furthermore, knowledge of the transmitters includes knowing and distinguishing the different ranks of the individual transmitters among the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation. The chains of transmitters also differ in respect to continuity or lack of continuity, in that a transmitter may not have known personally the transmitter on whose authority he transmits a tradition. They also differ in respect to their freedom from weaknesses which may affect them adversely. These differences lead to the designation of two kinds of chains, and the rule is that the highest 115 chain is to be accepted, and the lowest chain to be rejected. There are differences of opinion with regard to the intermediate kind, according to the transmitted statements of authorities on the subject. They have invented technical terms for classifying the various grades of reliability, such as sound, good, weak, skipping the first transmitter on Muhammad's authority, mursal, omitting one link, munqati, omitting two links, mudal, singular, shad, unusual, gharib, and the other terms in use among them. Each term has been treated by itself, and the existing disagreements or agreements among linguistic authorities concerning each term have been noted. Further, there is the study of how the transmission took place. It may have taken place by reading, qira'ah, by writing, kitaba, by getting the approval of the authority for written material, munawala, or by obtaining the permission of the authority to teach certain traditions, ijazah. One must study the difference in grade assigned to these different types of transmission, and one must also study the differences of opinion among scholars about what is to be accepted here and what to be rejected. Then, there follows the discussion of terms applying to the texts of traditions. A text may be unusual, gharib, or difficult, ambiguous, mushkil, or, affected by some, misspelling, or misreading, or, containing, homonyms, muftarik, or, containing, homographs, mukhtalif, or something else of this sort. This constitutes the largest and preponderant part of the studies of hadith scholars. The conditions of the transmitters of traditions in early Muslim times, the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation, were known to the people of their respective countries. There were transmitters in the Hijaz, in the Iraq in al-Basra and al-Kufa, and in Syria and Egypt. All of them were well known and famous in their day. The people of the Hijaz in these early times had fewer links in their chains of transmitters than others, and they were sounder transmitters, because they insisted upon probity and accuracy as necessary conditions of transmission. They were reluctant to accept, as a reliable transmitter, anyone whose condition in these respects was not known. These are the collections of traditions that are famous in Islam. They are the chief orthodox works on traditions. Though hadith works are numerous, reference is as a rule made to the books mentioned. The knowledge of all these conditions and technical terms is the science of tradition. The subject of abrogating and abrogated traditions is occasionally taken out and treated as a discipline by itself. The same applies to unusual traditions. There are famous works by scholars on that subject. Then, there are the homonyms. Scholars have written a great many works on the science of traditions. An outstanding hadith scholar was Abd Abdallah al-Hakim. His works on the subject are famous. He improved the science of tradition and presented it to its best advantage. The most famous work by a modern scholar on the subject is the book by Abu Amr as-Salah. He lived in the early part of the 7th–13th century. His example was followed by Muhyiddin an-Nawawi. The purpose of the discipline is a noble one. It is concerned with the knowledge of how to preserve the traditions, sunan, transmitted on the authority of the master of the religious law.